website should you want to watch it later or share it with friends who were unable to join tonight. So without further ado, I want to pass the program over to our speaker tonight. We have Professor Parakh Hoon from South Puget Sound Community College joining us tonight to speak to us about President Biden's foreign policy. And I think we're going to have a pretty exciting conversation tonight. Parakh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to put on my screen here, and I hope everyone can see that.
Yes.
Everybody can see my screen. So thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, St. Patrick's Day, an appropriate time. I can see Amy is wearing green, which is a good sign. I'm sort of supporting the Ukrainians, I guess, a little bit of blue here. The purpose of my presentation really was, I remember last year when Amy got in touch with me was right after the Biden administration took office. And I thought my presentation was last March. So I'd been taking notes all of this past year, and I'm like, oh, it's already been a whole year now. And I have an opportunity to share with you. Steve, did you have a question?
No, I accidentally clicked something.
No problem. Everyone can see the screen that I have. And as I was pointing out, the purpose of my presentation really is to share with you not just what's going on currently in the international system with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also to weave in how that perhaps also relates with a changing international system, and that this Russian incursion is another challenge to the liberal international order, which has been the dominant sort of framework for international affairs, especially since the Second World War. So my thesis today is that if we try to examine current events from this perspective, that many of these are an attempt to challenge the liberal international order, and returning to the world of Marco Polo, which for some of you, the map here on the right shows us the journey of Marco Polo across from the Persian Empire to China. And so my thesis is that the international system, the power dynamics are now shifting towards the Eurasian continent, and what we are seeing should be understood from that perspective. I'm going to point out the challenges that this presents for the Biden administration, as well as the other administrations that will follow, and how they have to sort of leverage the position of the United States, and to see if the role of the US is going to shift, what role would that take? So as we conclude, I would like us to reflect on these current two sort of challenges. One is the Russia and Ukraine challenge, and the other is the potential of conflict with China, and how might the US respond to avoid an escalation. The first thing, therefore, I wanted to point out was that in our field of international relations, what we try to do is to make sense of world politics from different levels of analyses, from an individual level of the personality perceptions of individual leaders, to the domestic context of states, to the sort of international level where we see the interstate interaction as well as non-state actors. So today I'm not going to speak so much about the individual level. I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards about the personalities and perceptions of individual leaders, including Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden, President Xi, and so forth. But I'd like to sort of focus on the state level, the domestic level first, and also share with you a certain trend that we are beginning to see with regard to the different types of regimes in the world today. And that might give us a sense of how to view this current moment in international relations. For most of us, when we think about the idea of the liberal international economic order, it is the set of institutions that have evolved in response to the major crises in Europe, vis-a-vis the First World War and the Second World War, and the attempts to coordinate both economic and security relations between these great powers, which leads us to the creation of what are called the Bretton Woods institutions. And these institutions have been the basis for organizing international relations for the last 70 years or so, especially after the Second World War. And what we are seeing now is a challenge to these institutions, and coming from states like Russia and China, for instance, is a way for us to examine whether or not these states are actually challenging our Bretton Woods institutions, or are they trying to make space for being able to participate on an equal footing? And I would argue that perhaps we would need to look at Russia and China indifferently when it comes to examining their respective roles in the international system. But the key part to keep in mind is that the system that we're talking about that comes into play is in response to the crises of the 19th century in terms of the wars, and then early 20th century between the First World War, then we have the Second World War, and it's right after that we see the creation of this set of institutions in which we are saying this is the liberal international economic and security order, which includes the IMF, World Bank, NATO, NAFTA, WTO, and the project of European integration. All of these were in response to the breakdown of order and security on the European subcontinent. And currently what we are seeing is with the war in Ukraine, as well as I said, with the question of rise of China, is a challenge potentially to this international system, which is undergirded by the dominance of the United States, both as a major superpower and also in terms of its currency being the dominant one in the international system. So what we see in the last 10 years, if 1990 was that third wave of democracy, where we had a major shift of countries towards liberal democracy and trying multi-party elections, allowing for a free media, that has taken a sort of has declined. For the first time, you're seeing in 2022 that there are only 34 countries in the world that can describe or consider themselves to be liberal democracies. It has been the lowest in 25 years. There are only 13% of the world population that actually live in a liberal democracy. What we are seeing is the rise of closed autocracies. There are about 30 countries that could be considered as dictatorships. And in this past year, we have also seen 5 military and 1 self-coup, the most coups that we have seen, I guess, in the 21st century. And finally, the other kind of sort of mixed regime, which is an electoral autocracy, which is sort of a nominal system where they are allowing elections, but it still has a lot of limits on the media, on political parties, on freedom of speech, and so forth. And that is where the majority of the world now lives. So this is the context in which the Joe Biden presidency is coming into play. And so we need to keep in mind that the world today is much more autocratic. Many more autocracies and even democracies have become more autocratic in the last 20 years. The term that we use to describe this in many of these countries is the strategy of what's called authoritarian populism, which is to use the strategy of both on the left or on the right to challenge what were the dominant political establishments and to use either a left-wing ideology of socialism and or a right-wing ideology of nationalism. But by combining this, the purpose of these leaders and these movements and parties has been to divide up their domestic societies into antagonist groups, into those who are really for the people and these so-called elites. And this view is considered as a sort of moral goal of theirs. And these parties and movements have also dismantled many of these democratic norms, constitutional checks and balances, as well as the ability of the institutions to work. So the part I'm trying to again emphasize is that in 2022, we are in a quite difficult place when it comes to looking at the international system with regard to the kind of regimes. And majority of these regimes are now authoritarian, autocratic, and a combination of this authoritarian populism. And this means that the societies are being divided and shaped into thinking about sort of themselves in sort of racial or ethnic terms, in terms of nationalism, which is more xenophobic, militant. There's a sense of threat from outsiders and an intolerance for multiculturalism. These positions are sort of cohering around these, again, parties, leaders, and social movements. And in Europe, we see the shift taking place across various former Soviet republics, former countries, Eastern European countries, as well as some of the Western European countries as well, including Austria or Italy or France, and even Germany and Spain. And if I would want to add India and the United States as well, in each of these societies, we have seen the move towards an authoritarian populist government, and the radical right movements take hold. And the reason I think this is really important to recognize is that this shows the fragmentation of power, the sort of breakdown of basic norms around, again, as I said, liberal democracy, both in international institutions as well as in domestic society. What this is also being driven by is this concept, which we now use, is called post-truth. These are post-truth societies in which we are seeing a manipulation of the media and information environment and the use of propaganda, both by state and non-state actors. Governments are using misinformation, not just sort of the media itself, but we're seeing a sort of integration of a number of domains of society come together to create this construct of post-truth, in which we see here, for instance, when we ask people about the perception about crime and homicides, a lot of people believe that this has been increasing. Respondents' belief in conspiracy theories has gone up. If you look at the amount of misinformation and reliable information, and this was earlier in 2015, though, that you see that social media also had a lot of fake news and misinformation. The construct that we therefore use for understanding this is that the media landscape in many of these countries has been susceptible structurally, and the architecture is such that now it is susceptible to disseminating manipulation and lies, which means we have to pay attention to how domestic publics are being socialized into thinking about these values of authoritarianism and nationalism and so forth. In the United States, what we really see happening in the last few years is a construct which we call asymmetric polarization. So, which is to say that there is polarization. There is a division between the left-wing sort of news media and the right-wing news media, but this is asymmetric. And by that, I mean that there is a gap between, there is no middle left anymore. There is no middle moderate news media in the United States media ecosystem. Instead, we have a whole lot of right-wing news entities that intersect and interact with each other, and they are disconnected from the rest of the media ecosystem. What we also observe is that there is an interaction between the left, the center, and a little bit on sort of the moderate groups here. And if there is a sort of, there's misinformation or there's false information, typically this is corrected. There is still professional mainstream journalism on this side of the media landscape. But when it comes to thinking about the right-wing ecosystem, first of all, as I said, there is no middle, moderate, center right. Instead, what we're finding is an extreme right. And here, what you're seeing is that if there's a false information or misinformation that comes out from these media outlets, the mainstream news outlets, instead of challenging that, are reinforcing that process. And so one can see this kind of dynamic in the media ecosystems across these countries, both democracies and autocracies. And so manipulation of the public through technology and through emerging new media is a key aspect of the dismantling of the liberal international order, both internationally and domestically. So the question then we would like to then explore, and I'd like to sort of try to unpack further, is how do we then interpret in this context what the Biden administration inherited? It inherited 4 years of Trump administration, which left it in a context of, with its hands tied, if you may, with Afghanistan, with a rising China, with the bilateral sort of interactions, as well as a decline of trust in the United States and in international cooperation. And the general perception that this is sending across to various regimes and what they've started to propagate is this view that the US is divided, it is increasingly disengaged from international affairs, it is retreating. We see a similar dynamic play out in Europe with the sort of exit of the United Kingdom and the sort of emergence of these right-wing populist movements that have challenged the European integration model. And this is changing the calculus of states around the world, especially those that are thinking about ways of moving outside of the sphere of influence of the United States and Europe, and instead align themselves then perhaps with China and or with Russia. And this is also based on this internal dynamic that we are seeing is the idea of returning back to a certain kind of nationalism, old legacies, whether it's Russian nationalism or Chinese nationalism, Iran, Turkey, and in India, the idea of an Indic civilization. And each of these countries, which are key sort of players in the international system, they are reflecting an approach which is beginning to, as I point out, to de-link from the European and the US security and economic system, and to try to sort of establish another sphere, which is, we would call the Eurasian continent here, where you got the Central Asian countries, Russia, and the rest of Asia, and de-link from parts of Europe, and of course, sort of move the United States, push them out in some ways. And this is something we want to explore as we look at this current conflict in Ukraine, if this strategy is in play when it comes to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And so in thinking about Russia, let's start with that as our first case study, how Russia is sort of establishing this basic sort of premise of challenging the international order is the view that as a nation state, the Russian state has a massive geography that on the one hand here connects with Europe and on the other side, it's connecting with the United States, and on its southern southern side, it has countries which were which are the Central Asian countries. So under the Soviet sort of empire or the Soviet system, we saw these countries, the Warsaw Pact states, come together. And for Russia right now, once that system has got dismantled after the 1990s, the question then is, what is the role of Russia in the world? And one of the arguments that we're finding is that for Russia, there has been an ambition to be recognized as a great power. And in order to be recognized as a great power, Russia then inserts itself in the business of states that have been intervening, with the argument that they have always been part of the Russian Empire. And so this geopolitical dynamic of Russian landmass, where it has no sort of borders or boundaries which protects us the way the United States has been protected, makes it seem that it's always under threat. And in order for it to sort of gain power in the international system, the way it does it is by threatening and co-opting the states that are adjacent to Russia.
Parakh, as you change screens, can we ask a question that's in the chat box?
Sure.
So this goes back to your analysis of kind of the media at this point in history. This question asks, I don't think of NYT, CNN, or WAPO as left-leaning media. I reserve that term for MSNBC, Mother Jones, Wilderness Watch, and such. Is this a false sense of centrism?
Fair enough. I mean, it's a good sort of way for us to consider what is actually left. The bigger observation here is the idea of the breakdown of the media landscape, where we don't have any moderate, middle of the road news media, especially on the right. So, we can debate how those who are, listening to Fox News characterize the New York Times. They see that as extremely left. But I take your point that, we can see that certain, MSNBC, Mother Jones, Wilderness Watch, etc., are further to the left. The question is, you're living in a false sense of centrism. I guess the argument is, where is that center? Is there a center in our media landscape? And do people actually view that as if they're able to find a media which is balanced? And I think what the research is showing is that for a lot of people, they don't trust the media. They see the media essentially as biased, and increasingly those on the right. But I think the point is well made, Jim, about
and there's a follow-up. I've heard that the New York Times is the new Pravda here in the United States. And this participant is beginning to agree. All
right. Okay. Thank you for that observation. And I think we have to keep in mind the sort of use of the media. And the two parts that I was trying to make here was that whether it's left or right, is there journalism, professional journalism, and integrity in the way in which the media is approaching, or has it been taken over by idea of misinformation or propaganda of deliberate misinformation, which in turn is further extended by the mainstream networks? And that's a phenomenon that we're finding. It's called asymmetric polarization, which we saw predominantly emerging from the 2016 election onwards. So to point out how to think about, again, the case study that I'm talking about here is of how to think about Russia as a sort of as a power in the international system, and what it sees its role in terms of in its regions, and how do we explain what is going on in Ukraine. And so one of the things which we see with Russia is that over the years, and not unlike China, Russian descent people have been settled across many of these former Soviet republics. In each of these countries, we have a Russian minority, and Ukraine is a sort of good example of that. And so in the argument that we're hearing from Putin and the sort of Russians is that this intervention in Ukraine is to restore the Russian sort of either the Russian empire or the Russian culture or the Russian sort of power in its region, responding to the NATO expansion over the last couple of decades following the end of the Cold War, and this is their way of pushing back. And the way Russia has gone about doing this, as we are all observing, is by invading a sovereign state, which from their point of view had already been invaded starting 2014, and then here in Crimea in 2008. So from their point of view, this is not something new. It is simply an ongoing process of Russian intervention in these regions to maintain their control. And the argument then I'm trying to point out here is that this, by doing this, Russia is sending a message to various states that are adjacent to Russia to say, not only in East Asia, Eastern Europe, but also in Central Asia, that if you try to move closer to the West, we will come in and challenge you, and this is our way of sending a message. And so we should expect this crisis to evolve into a form of a sort of a Cold War in which, not unlike East and West Germany, we may be seeing the emergence of an East and West Ukraine, with the Western part following in the Russian sort of sphere. And the reason Russia is able to do all of this is in part of its geography, and in this current moment, its access to natural resources and the reliance of, as all of you have been hearing for a long time, that the Russian oil and natural gas is central to many of the European countries, including Germany. And this debate over Nord Stream, debate over the pipeline that goes through Ukraine, which Russia believes is their oil and their natural gas, which they have to pay. You know, the Ukraine takes a certain percentage of that. So this is Russia's way of asserting its geopolitical power in this Eurasian context by pushing against Europe on the one hand, by sending a message to the former Soviet republics, as well as I said, sending a message to the Central Asian countries. And my argument here is that these countries, Central Asian countries, are equally, if not more important for Russia, as are these Eastern European countries. From Russia's point of view, if this is going to be successful, they would have managed to delink and reassert their control and hegemony over the Central Asian countries. And so to think about Russia, the challenge for Russia then is, does it see itself as a competitor or as an adversary to the Western alliance? And the sense that we are beginning to get is that perhaps Russia is a spoiler state, and as a declining power in the last 20 years, the population of Russia has not seen economic growth. Their inequality is higher, and the grip on power has sort of has been kept by increasing the manipulation of the public, the creation, for instance, of special Kremlin has got special forces of 300,000 Cossacks, which are out there threatening people. A lot of emphasis on the military-industrial complex, and then using its resources, which is all that it has at this moment, to sort of leverage its position. So if we want to think about the Ukraine conflict, even if we see it as a miscalculation, the point is this is a strategic opportunity, as I said, to send a message to former Soviet states to consolidate relations with autocratic inclined states. And this is the other part which we should pay close attention to, that countries that are deeply connected with the Russians with regard to the military assistance and those that rely on natural resources are, again, realigning and reconsidering their position vis-a-vis the United States. And this becomes clear when we look at the voting of various countries in response to the Russian aggression, the war invasion in Ukraine. And if you see this map, you can see that when we started, among all the autocracies in the world, all of them have supported, have abstained, or they have voted no in support of, or voted no for this resolution. What was also interesting was to see India, Pakistan also vote along with China when it came to this particular vote. And we can see again the two reasons that I pointed out. The first is that there is a alliance in terms of the military support that Russia has given these countries, and or they have also been, they are waiting for access to the natural resources that they get from Russia. And the same goes for many of these countries here that we see in Africa. I could argue maybe South Africa is also taking an ambiguous role, again, because of its reliance on Russian military, and they're using their non-aligned status in a sort of ambiguous way. But this is an alliance of autocracies that is coming together in response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The important part to recognize again is that Ukraine is just one example, and it is part of a bigger strategy and change in warfare, which we call hybrid warfare. And this is through, the argument here is that Russia, in the case of Ukraine, of course, has invaded, but in many of these other countries, it has used multiple strategies. It's military strategies, cyber warfare, as well as resources to make sure that they keep the pressure on in these countries and not allow them to sort of begin to get more aligned within the Western sphere, the liberal international economic order and the liberal, the NATO alliance and so forth. There's an argument here that, if, for instance, would Russia still have acted in this way if NATO had not expanded over the last 10 years? And this is a debate that we can have. If we believe that the Russian state inherently is a petro state, it is a non-democratic autocratic state, which is essentially finds itself threatened by the West, then we would argue that yes, regardless of whether NATO expansion had taken place or not, Russia would have continued to intervene. And this is the correct moment for Russia to do that because of oil prices. As I pointed out earlier, the weakness in the United States of what President Biden inherited from Trump, the economic challenges the US is facing, especially after 2008, the internal polarization, and the general sort of view among the population to not get involved in international affairs or international conflicts, which was quite evident with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So if you combine all of these, then you begin to see that Russia is challenging is challenging the international system because it is a declining power. Now let's turn to the case of China and try to see how China is similar or different. And here I would like to posit that China is a rising power, and we have to be careful if we want to put China and Russia on the same sort of page and say they are both autocracies and we need to see them as adversaries. Or do we want to see China in a separate vein, in part because China also benefits from international stability and international order, and it would like to benefit from the international system so long as China is allowed to rise and exercise its own sovereignty. And this is where we will get into a potential challenge with regard to this new emerging order, and which we will see in this sort of in how Russia is going to operate in this zone. So let me share with you here, and then I'll go back and explain what really is going on. Okay, yeah, let's explain this part. So the new way of thinking about warfare, again, and putting aside this Russian invasion in Ukraine, is to actually not go to war with another nation state, but rather to use what's called gray zone or gray zone war, which is neither war nor peace. It is keeping the pressure on and doing this, especially in this context of the South China Sea. This is the area where we can expect a major escalation at some point in the next 2 to 5 years. As the Russian-Ukrainian situation will further deteriorate and will become into this Cold War kind of scenario, we will see that this is also sending a sort of a test case for how China is potentially going to respond in South China Sea. And the strategy for both is in their zones, what they see as their zone of influence. And when it comes to territorial integrity, there is a clearer understanding of sovereignty. The problem is when we get into the high seas and when we start thinking about space. That is where there is ambiguity and a debate over international law, and China is challenging, again, the Westphalian liberal international order by pointing out that anybody who tries to intervene in its zone is going to be challenged. And the way to do this is not to go to war, but keep up the pressure and make the cost of intervention costly and risky, which is exactly what Russia has done now. And with going, in some ways, going to war with Ukraine, is that it has made it very difficult for the US to get involved because it's got nuclear power. And similarly here too, we will see a variety of strategies of using military, economic, diplomatic, intelligence, criminal means to achieve sort of a political goal. So in terms of thinking about how what is that area that is really problematic, as I point out, is what's called the 9-dash line, and how it challenges the international order. As I said, this is sort of an interesting dynamic. On the one hand, China benefits from the international system, and it's not like Russia is a spoiler state. But at the same time, it is going to use its own sort of claim to a broader region, which is here in South China Sea, to make a case that all of this is under the Chinese jurisdiction. And the reason for that is that in international law, the first 12 miles of contiguous zone is considered to be part of the territorial sovereignty of a state. After 12 miles, we enter what's called the exclusive economic zone. And so all of these areas are part of an exclusive economic zone. And various countries here, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan, which is actually not a separate country, but and Japan, all lay claim to particular islands in this area. And the US has also got claims over Spratly Islands. So I think it's one of the Western powers has power over the Spratly Islands. So what then China does is that over the last 10 years, it has started constructing artificial islands in this area. By doing that, it has begun to challenge the power of the neighboring states by saying, if you come under in our zone, we will be able to, it is our claim. So the part I'm saying is the potential threat that will come would be when, which is already happening, is there are these artificial islands, and in those artificial islands, China can claim 12 miles of sovereign control and deny access to any of these countries. And by doing that, it will escalate. And if this escalates further, it leads to a potential crisis, in part because this region is a central part of Chinese power in a number of ways. First, all of China's oil and transportation that takes place comes through this area, the South China Sea. And in the South China Sea, potentially there's also oil and natural gas. So China believes that it needs to have control over this area. Second, what China has been doing for the last 20 years or so, and increasingly now, which is the idea of what is called the New Silk Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. If you see here, this is the investments of China and view or vision of China over the next 10 years is to make sure that it continues to get access to oil, natural gas, which it needs. China burns the most coal, and in order for it, it will continue to do that in order to meet its energy demands. But in order for China to continue to grow, it will need access to further oil and natural gas from Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and all the Central Asian countries. And so the part I'm trying to make a case here is that this Belt and Road Initiative is another way for China and Russia to begin to sort of align or realign the international system in a non-Western context, shifting the focus towards the Eurasian continent. So in the next 10 to 20 years, the area that the region of the world, which will become increasingly important, is, as I said, the Central Asian region with Kazakhstan. And this is where Russia and China potentially will may have a conflict. And this is where the US will have to sort of explore whether they're going to see China and Russia together, or are they going to figure out a way to keep these two states sort of from aligning with each other? And if so, how would that be possible? The place where we will really see Russia and China again play a major role is up here in the North Pole. Greenland is has its own autonomy, and many of the native communities there have access. This is considered common pool resources. Denmark has provided support for them, but when it comes to this whole area next to Russia, Russia sees access to the North Pole, to the Arctic here, a place for major resource exploration and for challenging the West. So again, to summarize, what I'm trying to point out here is that we need to see the Russian invasion in Ukraine in light of the push towards the Eurasian continent by sending a message to the Eastern European and Central Asian countries, but looking forward in the next 10 years to 5 years of connecting these other countries in through infrastructure projects, through investing, and then putting up and then getting the natural resources, oil and natural gas. And then in return, what China is able to provide these countries is an access to money and a political system which helps them control. Amy? Did you have a question, Amy?
Yep, we have a question in the chat directly related to this. Will China buy up all of the Russian oil exported from the West Coast now that buyers such as Hawaii, the US mainland, and other countries using these West Coast exports are shunning Russian oil? If so, does the sanction accomplish anything?
Correct, and that's a really good question. What I was reading was Russian oil is really dirty and thick oil. And
sorry, Russian East Coast. Or correction.
Right. Correct. And so, yes, the challenge now for the Europeans and our sort of refineries in the US is that if they don't have access to Russian oil, how are they going to meet that demand? Because they rely on that dirtier oil. And that's why the Biden administration has reached out to Venezuela and other countries to see if they can help. And that is exactly what Russia is hoping, is that it's squeezing the West because of their reliance on their oil. But I think Europe has a greater challenge, especially Germany, rather than the United States in that sense. The other part which relates to this question is the alliances, correctly as you're pointing out. These are resource alliances. What is really interesting to see, as I was saying, is that how countries are reassessing their position. Who visited President Putin in the last 2-3 weeks was the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He was there, and the ambassador to China went and met the opposition party leaders in Pakistan to point out that, look, we want stability in Pakistan. And Pakistan, as you can see, is going to benefit from this major port, Gwadar port, and that's going to directly connect it to Central Asian countries and be able to move goods and services from there to the coast. And that would allow then China and Russia to benefit from this alliance. Similarly, as you are seeing in the case of Sri Lanka, China has an alliance where they have created, they have taken over the port in Colombo with an agreement with India saying, okay, we won't use it for security purposes. But all of this is creating a kind of string of alliances, ports, and refineries, military installations that would circle and avoid sort of linking up with Europe and, of course, the United States. So the purpose here is then to try to create a system in which China is able to continue to benefit, but do so in a way that doesn't rely as much on, here's the argument, not on just on US and European power, but an alternative system. And that is what makes it more troubling, is that the kind of system that is taking hold in these countries is what I pointed out earlier. It's autocratic. It is designed on a different form of reciprocity, long-term patronage. And it's in the difference between Russia and China then is Russia as a petrostate and a declining power would resort to invasion. For China, it is money, and then through the data and the support that it is setting up this infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure, they have a capacity to shut it down. And so if any country tries to sort of move away from the Chinese influence, they would have to sort of face that. And Pakistan is a classic example of a state which on the one hand owes debt to Saudi Arabia, and now it's deeply linked with China, and it has to figure out how it's going to sort of re-pivot away from the United States in a way that it can join that alliance.
We have a question here. Do you see any trends that tend toward cultivating liberal democracies?
Good question, and let's. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes as we talk about. I'm getting exactly to that, and that I think is the hard choice that we will have to face. As I said, that so the changing nature of war, as I pointed out, is to challenge the United States, not directly, and this is where the Russian aggression in Ukraine is kind of puzzling from the point of view of China, because they have escalated this. And as I point out, the escalation is a calculation on the part of Russia, which is that this is the right moment. There's a number of events that have come together that makes President Putin believe that for better or for worse, this is eventually going to benefit Russia because it's anyway on a decline, and might as well just blow it all up now and let the new order, a new sort of international order emerge in which Russia will be a central player. And at the same time, this idea of hybrid warfare, of cyber warfare, of economic, diplomatic, intelligence, criminal means to challenge the Western powers. And all of this is setting in play the shift towards the Eurasian space to counter the Western Atlantic Alliance, which was the dominant way the world worked, especially after the Second World War. And so as we move towards the middle of the 21st century, we can begin to see a sinosphere, as I was laying a reference to when Marco Polo was traveling all the way from Venice and coming down to Kublai Khan and meeting the sort of Han Empire, and the China was sort of was a major power, a civilization. This is sort of returning to that sense of a greater civilizational focus. And in some ways, it sort of denotes Samuel Huntington, who 20 years ago, 30 years ago, had sort of pointed out that perhaps the middle of the 20th century, we will be seeing the resurgence of nationalisms of varieties of civilization at the level of civilization, not so much as the Islamic versus the West, but in terms of these nationalities which are claiming broader historicity, like a pre-Western identity, which they want to bring back into their system, which is happening in India, which is happening in Turkey, Russia, and China. And so to the question, what do we do? How do we now see in 2021, as I point out, for the first time in 20 years, we are only 13% of the world population lives in a liberal democracy. Majority of countries have shifted towards an autocratic direction. They are either autocratizing or they are already electoral autocracies. And they would benefit from the Chinese and the Russian model, which doesn't ask them for human rights, which doesn't ask them for respecting free media and so forth. And so to sort of answer the question, I am not quite hopeful in the near future, not in the next 5 years, of countries moving in the direction of liberal democracy. I'm expecting a more right-wing turn, including here in the United States, a switch to a conservative majority, both in the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Same in India will continue. And the world will see over the next 5 to 10 years this shift, which is going to challenge the Western European Atlantic order. I think that is pretty much my spiel for the moment. And I'd like to see if we have some questions and we can dig deeper into some aspects.
Yeah, so we do have a question that I think you have something to say about. How does global warming fit into all of this? And it's okay to predict worlds now, but what if we're all much poorer?
Great question. And I think that is where the question of interdependence will be central. We cannot achieve net zero. We cannot achieve the climate change goals without cooperation. By decoupling with China, there is no way the United States will get access to its rare earth materials. At the same time, China's use of coal will increase for the next 10 years, at least till 2030. And they will continue to increase their emissions. So how are we going to reconcile that with allowing with China to do that, and at the same time say that we would like to ask countries to sort of reduce their emissions? So I think the two kind of scenarios that I can see is that perhaps this would allow a place for countries to reorganize and realign the interests is to address climate change, but only if the domestic publics, I would say only if the regimes can find some way to accept that interdependence is important. And this is why I was saying that we have to treat China and Russia differently. If we put them in the same category, then we will make that mistake. If we treat them separately and work with them in a way, with China sort of giving space to China to play a bigger role, we potentially can see them participate in addressing climate change. On the other hand, the risk, as we have heard people point out, is that we cannot trust, as we have not been able to trust Russia, and we've tried to bring China in for the last 10, 20 years, and look what's happened. Instead of becoming more democratic, it's become more authoritarian. Instead of trying to work, it's become much more jingoistic and nationalistic. So these will be hard choices in the next 5 years or so.
So there's a request to come back to the question that you said that you postponed and then I think answered in one way, but maybe it's more of a hopeful request. Do you see any trends that tend towards cultivating liberal democracies? I think that's more of a, do you see any trends?
It's a great question, and all our theories of modernization point out that with education, with greater access for women joining the workforce, countries tend to become, they are more like no bourgeois, no democracy. That was, Barrington Moore's basic argument that once we have a middle class, we begin to see a demand for greater claims and so forth. What is confounding this is the view of nationalism in each of these countries, which is the sort of an anti-West nationalist sentiment, and that has been cultivated as an ideology in each of these non-Western countries: India, Russia, China, including many of the African countries, and it's sort of it's tolerating autocracy with the belief that that is how we'll be able to achieve material wealth and growth. And so I think the question for our time is exactly that, right? That is, in this century, who is going to emerge? Is it going to be authoritarian regimes that will emerge and say, look, the bottom line is to deal with the material needs of our populations. They want growth and development, and we will cut emissions, but we will first grow, and we don't want democracy because democracy works against this. And there is no need for China or Russia to allow for a democratic system to continue because that challenges their system. So there is no way that they would allow countries to shift in that direction. And that's the challenge with Ukraine. As Ukraine becomes more democratic, as they become more westernized, it's on right next to Russia, and it is setting a bad example. Everybody around is going to start behaving like that. Nina?
Well, we have some earlier questions that I think are directly related to what you were just saying. How stable are the governments of these autocratic countries, China, Russia, India, Venezuela, Pakistan, Poland, Hungary? What would the effect of a collapse of the current autocracies mean to the world order?
Correct. So when we say these autocracies collapse, it means who's taking over? Is it the military? Or is it going to be a combination of a communist party, like a party system? And so what one can expect is that if you're going to work with China, they'll support you and they will keep the elites in power, provide them with the resources that are needed. And guess what? We'll give you the surveillance as well. Because with that infrastructure comes our system of governing, if you may, and a military industrial complex, which gives you a information system and everything else that you can continue to, shape the ideology of your population, which keeps them skeptical of the West and democracy and all of those norms. And they have succeeded in sort of shaping the public opinion through a variety of means, as I pointed out. The polarization we are seeing in the US is sort of what is, you can imagine what's going on in India, in China, and elsewhere. If here we are seeing such a breakdown and fragmentation, there is no way. That's the first thing an autocratic regime does. It takes control of mass communication. So no, I'm not too optimistic about countries shifting into a democratic direction in the next 5 years, unfortunately.
I've unmuted Nina to let her ask her question aloud, and then we can come back to the remaining questions in the chat box.
Yeah, sorry I couldn't put it in the chat box. It's maybe a little too complicated. Professor Hoon, thank you very much for your presentation, most helpful. I recently read Robert Kagan's book, The Jungle grows back. It's actually 2018. And his premise there is this, yes, after World War II, the United States was sort of given the role of police force to keep security in place so that everybody else could prosper and grow. And after World War II, everyone was so tired of that, they were happy to have us do that. If this is changing now and the power is shifting, what's your, I don't know if it's prognosis or perception of who would then be that military peace, so-called peace provider? I don't want to say policeman, but peace provider. And I'm not sure how this structure would be recreated that we have now of the United States as the world's police force. What would take the place?
Good question, right? I mean, if so, it's the neo-feudalism model. Like, we are entering this period of alliances, which will eventually be more of a bipolar system once it settles in between the US and China. My realist IR scholars like John Mersheimer and others are basically say that big powers are just like big powers. They're like billiard balls. You cannot stop them. They are going to go and shatter, and it is not possible to have a peaceful rise of China without challenging, as you said, the United States and disrupting the rule of law, the rule of international order, peacekeeping, and the rest. What's going to replace is going to be, there may be zones of liberalism, in the sense, zones of countries that are democratic and aligned, and then there are zones of country that are sort of ambiguous, they're unclear, they're playing both sides, and then there are countries that are clearly aligned. I mean, this is, as I said, we have the lowest number of democracies in the world today in the last 20 years. I mean, it's only 13% of the population in the world that's now living in only 34 countries are liberal democracies. I mean, to me, that's frightening in certain ways, that we have basically lost all the ground that we made after the end of the Cold War in shifting in that direction. And so increasingly, as I see more conflict, chaos over the next short term, and maybe by the 2030s, not this 5 years, but after these next 5-8 years, we may see some other alignment emerge. But this is going to be a very complicated period, given as I said, given the sort of challenges with regard to the internal dynamics of these countries, the indebtedness of the US, the division within the US, the demographic change that's happening. So the US is turning inward. Europe is concerned about maintaining, and it's sort of again shrinking, and it's trying to hold its own. And we've been hearing, oh, maybe this is bringing everyone together and we're finally kind of organizing. But in a condition where majority of your debt is owned by China, why you are relying on all these countries for natural resources. So I don't see how they're going to allow democracies to thrive.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. I'll turn it back over to Amy.
Great, thank you. So this question and a comment in relation to growing and shrinking populations. So population and fertility is at or below replacement everywhere in the world except for Africa and the Islamic world. Where does this lead over the next few decades? And a related comment, I wonder if the existential crises of overpopulation and the climate emergency and its associated disasters are driving populations toward the perceived safety of autocratic leaders. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, right? So China is a great example of the sort of one-child policies effects of having this old population with a lot of young males fewer females, and now trying to sort of manage the sort of expectations of this youth. The same in India. We have an emerging youth which is demanding a material life, and is very, over the last 20 years, has been shaped by a rhetoric of nationalism, the Indic civilization, critiquing the West, finding their own sort of, it's sort of reinventing their own sort of past for the 21st century. And this is very different from the Western countries, which, like Japan and the United States, where we have an aging population. We have an older population, which will be much more. So I see it's not so much the overpopulation, but rather the demographic shifts that are driving the policies in each of these countries. In Africa, we'll have a similar challenge to meet the demands of a young population, right? So how does that matter? And so are they going to turn towards democracy, or are they going to turn towards nationalism as a sense of meaning and belonging? And that will be our question. And I think the autocratic leaders correctly, as you're saying, they point to a certain sense of safety that we are at least delivering. And liberal democracies have been problematic, right? Because we're seeing manipulation in the media. We've got single party systems. Liberal democracy is not sort of, it's minimalist. It's not a deliberative democracy. Most of us are dissatisfied with our liberal democracies. But here we're just moving away from that into a whole new way of organizing these countries around as dictatorships and as electoral autocracies.
Thank you. It looks like that concludes our questions. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting the presentation to come up in this major negative sort of view, maybe more realistic in terms of where we are today. And, you know, I'm, again, it's a challenge for us. I think and this is where I believe that this coming generation, if we are able to convey to them from my point of view, when I look at my students, I speak to them, they're all interested in addressing climate change. When I talk to people in various other countries that I've visited, there too, there's a great desire among people to see that change. So, you know, in some ways, it's the elites. It's the concentration of power and the sort of inequality, perhaps, that is that is something we should worry about. It's also this new phenomenon, as I'm saying, maybe we have to lower our expectations and be more realistic and say, if we want to address climate change, and as I said, these are hard choices, are we going to then work with countries which are different from our system? And if so, what effects will that have on human rights, on a variety of norms that we have taken as a given? So yeah, hopefully, if we maybe in a few years we come back, we see a difference. Maybe I hope I'm wrong. How about that? I hope I'm wrong in pointing out that the next few years are going to be complicated and problematic and yeah.
Well, we hope to have you back to have you analyze where you went wrong. How's that?
Excellent. I'd be great for me to be wrong and see the world sort of come together and find solutions and to sort of some change that is in a positive direction, and we can use our technologies, bring people together and address the major challenges that are coming up in the next 5-10 years. As I said, we cannot resolve the climate problem without thinking about interdependence and cooperation, because the global system is so deeply intertwined. The reality is that, maybe I'll share this last for some level of positive, for all of us to say that, look, we sink or swim together. We can think of the world in terms of this kind of nationalism, but we need to recognize that the world is increasingly deeply interconnected in so many ways, in movement of goods and services, and natural resources, in movement of people. And so unless we figure out a way to sort of build on this, it's going to be a major crisis for all of us.
One last comment, Amy, to leave on a positive note. Look how much the Ukrainians have defeated Russian troops all along for 3 weeks. So there's something to be proud of there. So thank you again for your presentation.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation tonight, Parakh. And as a reminder, this recording will be shared out on the Olympia World Affairs Council website. So please share it with your friends and families and colleagues, and encourage them to watch it. I think they'll be very interested in hearing Parakh's presentation. And as a reminder, our next month's program in April, the third Thursday in April, we will start the meeting with the election of the board of directors for the coming year. So members will be able to vote. And so we encourage you to come join that meeting and plan to vote for the board of directors, and then proceed with our final program of the program year in April. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Parakh, again for this thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.